Now to one of the big stories of the day. The former Prime Minister and previously MP for Huntingdon, Sir John Major, has been giving evidence today at the public inquiry into the infection of people with contaminated blood in the 70s and 80s. The disaster has been called the worst of its kind in NHS history. Up to 30,000 people contracted HIV and hepatitis C after being given a treatment meant to improve their lives. Questions have been asked about what the government knew about the risks of the blood treatments and whether patients were given proper warning. Sir John Major, who represented Huntingdon in the 80s and 90s, gave evidence under oath to the inquiry.
There was very widespread support within Parliament and within the governing party for the position of the haemophiliacs. As the situation became better known, it was becoming more understood in Parliament and more known in Parliament. Now, Parliament's often like a great tanker. It takes a long time for something to turn it round. And I would certainly say, in retrospect, that the way opinion was building, it was beginning to turn around. But ministers aren't some different breed who are completely distracted and unaffected by the same emotions that affect backbench members of Parliament. So it wasn't that the government was just reacting to pressure. The government could see the case for help, as well as the backbenches.
John Major speaking to the public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal earlier today. Let's bring in Des Collins, senior partner at Collins Solicitors, who's advising 1,500 victims based in Watford. Hello, Des.
Hello.
It'll seem a long time for many people that this happened in the 70s and 80s, and it's only now in 2022 that we're having this, and it's not expected to report for at least another year. It's a long time, isn't it?
It is. It's an incredibly long time. I mean, you're thinking of 30 or 40 years where people have campaigned unsuccessfully, largely, for any investigation into this tragedy. The present inquiry was finally announced by Theresa May in 2017, really kicked off in 2018, and it's effectively the biggest public inquiry the country's ever seen. At far too long a time, but hopefully we're now getting to the point where questions will be answered.
Well, Sir John Major's had plenty of time to think about what he might say to the inquiry. What did you make of his comments?
He is a very measured and competent performer. He wouldn't have risen to the heights he did in politics and government if he wasn't a measured performer. He was almost speaking to a script, and I don't mean that in a nasty way. It's clearly something he has thought about very carefully, and to a large extent has anticipated the questions which were going to be put to him. But effectively, he majored on the idea that there could, at that time, and still there can't be, according to government policy, a system of no-fault compensation. So what he said was, we didn't think there was anyone at fault, therefore we couldn't compensate. Now, that was hardwired into him, and it came over again and again over the whole day he was in evidence, or gave evidence. But, of course, what he missed out was, well, did anyone really inquire as to whether anyone was at fault? And that's the real issue which this inquiry is trying to get to grips with.
You can audibly hear the gasps from the families watching and listening to him give evidence when he used the language that he did. Incredibly bad luck, he said. He's since apologised for the choice of language, I can tell you. He said, though, I can only say to people it wasn't intended to be offensive. I was seeking to express the fact that I was concerned about what happened. People were offended, though, weren't they?
Yes, there was an audible gasp. The victims who I represent, who were either watching online or were at the inquiry today, were absolutely appalled at what he said. My jaw dropped when I heard what he said. Yes, you're right. He pulled back from that right at the end of his evidence when the chair asked him if he had anything else to add, and he apologised, said it was a misuse of words. It wasn't what he intended. I suspect, being as fair as I can to him, that's probably not what he meant. But there again, he is a very polished and expert performer, and I think he should have thought far more carefully about what he said, even if it was unintentional, given the pain and suffering these victims have gone through over the last 40 years.
To be fair to him, I should point out that Sir John did not hold a position in government in the 70s or early 80s when most of those infected were treated with contaminated blood products. But of course he held senior positions after that when compensation was being discussed in the late 80s and 90s. He was Chancellor, then Prime Minister.
Yeah, he came in as Prime Minister, as we all know, following Margaret Thatcher. What's known as the HIV settlement, which was a piece of litigation which was being conducted in the 80s and drifted on into the early 90s, he had the awful task of bringing that to a conclusion in terms of not putting forward, but agreeing settlement proposals on the part of the government. It was a poison chalice which he inherited from Margaret Thatcher. To all intents and purposes, from what we now know, Margaret Thatcher was quite against compensating the haemophiliacs at that time. His evidence is that he did try and bring her down to earth to some extent, and indeed some payment was made to the haemophiliacs at the time, but it wasn't compensation, it was charity. And there's a big difference between putting a begging bowl forward and saying, I'll take some charity, and getting what you're entitled to.
Campaigners say those infected many decades ago, as we've discussed, are now dying at the rate of 1 every 4 days as a result of what happened. It must be devastating for all of you involved in this to deal with, Des, as this slowly rumbles on at its very slow pace.
Well, that's right. I mean, to some extent, it's a victim of COVID. There have been delays to the inquiry when one didn't anticipate those delays would happen. We have got an opportunity now because the government did put in place effectively a report to consider compensation of the victims. That report is going to be considered by the inquiry next week. And we're hopeful that at long last something will happen to move this forward. But otherwise, we are now looking at probably the inquiry reporting in the early part of next year, and or finishing, I should say, coming to an end in the early part of next year, and reporting in the middle of 2023, which would mean that any compensation for the victims will be delayed for at least another year, and that really is intolerable.
I mean, it's a tough question to answer, but is there any point to a public inquiry that takes so long and at the end gives you a result when it's too late for those that need it most?
I mean, that is a very good point. There is a point. There is justification for the inquiry, and those victims who have been waiting for it for 30 or 40 years would agree with that, I know. What I think they would have liked to see and expected to see was the inquiry moving with greater speed, and possibly, as the evidence came out and the conclusions which might be reached could have been reached, that compensation would be forthcoming at an earlier stage. As I say, we have that, albeit very late this time next week, and hopefully that there will be more positive news there.
Des Collins, thank you for joining us. Senior partner at Collins Solicitors, advising 1,500 of those victims who received contaminated blood in the 70s and 80s. 20 past